So I'm in the enviable position of standing between you and the end of the conference. Oh, joy. I'm here to talk about the CIDR working group in the IETF. The CIDR working group is working on the resource PKI that you've heard mentioned a couple of times here. I'm giving you my own interpretation of the status of various items, various issues that have been discussed recently. I'm not speaking in any official capacity. I'm in the lucky position that many of the people who are hotly involved in some of this discussion decided not to come to this NANOG, so they can complain to me on email, but they can't throw fruit. This is a reminder of what the resource PKI is. It's certificates which capture the prefix allocations so that you can state with some authority who is the holder for any particular prefix by following the certificate chain. That work is fairly mature. The certificates have been discussed, and we're about ready for last call on some of those things. Beyond the certificates, there's something called the route origin authorization, the ROA, and that's the routing part. That's where the prefix holder gets to say who is the authorized AS to originate a route for this particular prefix. And it's set up so that a prefix holder can authorize multiple ASs to originate a route to its prefix. Okay, so now to the issues. We got started discussing how this might actually get employed in routing operations. One of the first ideas was a ROA sounds a whole lot like a route object in RPSL. There are people who use RPSL route objects to generate prefix filter lists. So there was an idea to map a database of ROAs to create similar route objects, very simple route objects. This is great because it fits in with all existing prefix filter generation tools, because they'll let you take input from multiple RPSL route object databases. But there's an interesting caveat that the route object is attested to by both the prefix holder and the AS holder. The ROA is only attested to by the prefix holder. So you can come up with an interesting situation that Jeff Houston was kind enough to point out to everybody. Suppose you are a ISP that uses route objects to generate prefix lists. Suppose you have a neighbor who doesn't produce route objects at all. Kind of depends on what you do with that. There are no route objects for these prefixes information. If you generate no filter at all, that is, you accept anything from that neighbor, then there's no problem. If you generate an empty filter from no route objects, you generate an empty filter, then you're blocking all prefixes from that neighbor. Then somebody else produces a, I got this wrong. Somebody else produces a ROA. Their ROA becomes the only input to your route filter. You generate one, a filter list that has one entry on it, and then you block everything. And I think I got those backwards. So the question is, would this system of generating route objects from ROAs work in with your existing prefix generation tools, and how well would it work, and would it present you with some additional problems? The fix to the particular vulnerability is to take care what you do if you are generating prefix filters from databases, and one of the databases is generating from ROAs. Okay, so the second issue is, where's the root to this RPKI? In the prefix allocation hierarchy, the root is IANA. IANA issues /8s to the RIRs, and it goes down from there. No problem. We're not certain that IANA will take on the task of producing the root to this RPKI. Nothing says that they won't, it's just that we don't have assigned on the dotted line that they will. If they don't, the next logical candidate is for the RIRs, but that's multiple routes, and you don't want them conflicting with each other. You don't want RIPE issuing certificates for prefixes that Aaron says they are properly authorized for. So if you have these multiple routes, then operators can decide on their own who's authorized to speak for what prefixes, but then they have to update that every time that the RIRs get different /8s. That begins to sound a lot like bogon filters, and we all know how successful bogon filter updates have been. So the specifications as is go through some careful work to say how you might deal with multiple trust anchors without answering the question of how you prevent them from conflicting with each other, relying on the, quote, relying parties, the people who are pulling down all this stuff. There are people who have been very vehement on the list that the specifications should say IANA, that there is one route, it's IANA, and nothing else will work. Can't actually say that because we have no means to make that happen, and we have no means to prevent relying parties from choosing certs RS to be their route. But it would be very useful if the operators could speak up about the operational impact to them of having one versus multiple trust anchors. Okay. Then we come to the issue of this thing won't just magically turn on, there won't be a flag day. So we have to deal with the possibility that some people will be producing ROAs for their routes and some people won't. What do you do when you get in a route that has a ROA associated with it and a route that does not have a ROA associated with it? When we get to full deployment, this is not really a problem. Those routes which don't have ROAs are trash and you trash them. But which announcements in partial deployment, how do we represent which announcements are supposed to have ROAs so you know to pick up the one that has a ROA and drop the one that doesn't have a ROA? One idea that has been presented is to have something called a bogon origin authorization, which says, I do not intend to announce these prefixes, believe no routes for these prefixes. That's the definition, but when you get into the way that we're talking about validating things with those BOAs, if a BOA exists for a prefix and there's a ROA for the prefix, something that says, yes, this is okay, believe the ROA. So the BOA is more like, don't believe any routes except those that you do receive ROAs for. The other idea that has been discussed is that look at these ROAs as if they were exclusionary, kind of like a default deny. If there are ROAs for a route, no routes that don't have ROAs should be believed. But there's a problem with that if you're not going to announce it at all, you're not going to be producing any ROAs for this prefix. These might be prefixes that you've been allocated but you're not yet announcing, or they're prefixes for internal infrastructure. We had someone talking yesterday about attacks on their internal infrastructure, and so they decided just not to announce that anymore, but that doesn't mean somebody else can't announce it. So if you're not going to announce it at all, one possibility is create a ROA for some fictitious AS that would never be accepted, something like AS0. And then, because the set is exclusionary, no other routes that didn't have ROAs associated with them would be accepted. And we're beginning to discuss various ideas of if you had these sorts of things in the RPKI system, how would you use those in validating routes? If you looked at the route that you received. How would you compare a BOA to a ROA? Less specific prefix to a more specific prefix. All of those things are being discussed. So there are questions that would be nice for the operators to answer, like if the operational use under one of these scenarios was that you had to you had to create ROAs for all of the routes that you announce. Would that be a problem, or are you likely to do all or none? 2 minutes, okay. Then there's the other partial deployment problem of you've decided to do the RPKI, you've decided to create ROAs for all of the routes that you announce. You allocate a prefix to a customer, they're not ready to do this yet. But they are multi-home, so they do want to produce route announcements on their own. How is somebody out in the world going to understand the difference between their route announcement and a more specific prefix hijacking against your valid routes? So one possibility is that if you have a clueless user, you take on the responsibility of producing ROAs for them. Or perhaps you create a new service that they subscribe to that would have you doing that, but who knows if they would pay money for this feature. If you do that, are you going to do it for your clueless customers, clueful customers? Are you going to take on the responsibility for the grandchildren? It would be nice to have some input from you about how this all happens. And please, get involved in the discussion. If there's any way that we can make the discussion simpler for you to get involved in, and you don't have to get involved in the multiple email chains. The only way to make sure that the answers to this are helpful for your sanity and helpful for your networks is to get your input.
Thank you, Sandy.